Hello there, my name is Saban White.
And I'm Brittany Bailey. We are from PrideHive Creations. And today we're going to talk to you about dress-up games.
Games. With dresses.
A dress-up game isn't necessarily a game where you just have dresses. You can have shirts and pants and all kinds of other stuff. Basically, a dress-up game is where you have a character, and then you can click on or put on a whole bunch of different kinds of clothes and accessories.
And just dress them up like that. We actually have a dress-up game soon on our way, so you can check our site and it'll just be there, and you can just have a blast. We have a whole bunch of different designs, very colorful and creative. So you just use your creative mind and just dress up your base character.
Yeah, that's Princess Dress Up by PrideHive. We're going to tell you a little bit about the process of making and going through a dress-up game. If you want to start a dress-up game, you first have to come up with a theme. You have to decide, what do you want your character to be dressed up in? For us, it was the princess outfits. So, lots of dresses, lots of nice hairstyles, like that. After you decide on your theme, you have to create a base. The base can be any kind of way you want it, whatever drawing style you're used to. Just draw a person, and then you don't want to add too much detail in the drawing because you're going to scan it onto your computer and do all the coloring there. That would be the best way to do it, so you can just change everything on the computer. After you draw your base, you want to draw all your clothing, accessories, hair, shoes, things like that.
And there's where you want to just go all out and just fill up all the different areas where to draw, like get a whole bunch of tops, a whole bunch of bottoms, and just have fun.
And if you're feeling in the mood, you can also come up with backgrounds. The next part, after you draw all these things, would be to scan it into your computer and color. Everyone likes coloring. You just color in your drawing of the body and color in your dresses and shirts and pants and shoes and all these things.
That's good stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot of coloring. If you've been on our Facebook page, facebook.com/PrideHive, you might see my post where it was like, coloring takes a lot of time. And it does.
But it's fun, so it's a lot of time.
And then you can change the colors, you can do all that. And then once you do that, you have to I'm not going to go too in depth because
it's a pretty long process, but
yeah, it's a lot of saving and looking at this way and looking at this way to make sure it fits on this character like that, and make sure it's not the wrong color, and
yeah, it's all that stuff. But
especially if you're picky, and if you want to put out the best that you have. After you have saved all your articles of clothing and accessories, you want to program it.
With programming, it's like each clothes is going to be a certain layer, and it's basically putting a layer on top of a layer that makes it look like one image.
Exactly. I'm also not going to go into the programming because that's
even longer.
That's even longer. But after you program it, you want to put some music in so that your players can enjoy the soft elevator music in the background while they're dressing up their character, and then you have a dress-up game, and voila. So that's the basic process of a dress-up game. I hope you enjoyed this video. And I hope you will buy our game and check out our game. Check out our site, PrideHive.com. This is PrideHive Creations signing off.
Yeah.